Well, good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you guys. Thank you for having us. We are, like Anna said, from the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and we'll be here with you today and tomorrow, talking about, some ways of reaching out to the AAPI community here in Napa, culturally responsive services for the AAPI community.
Oh, thank you again. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Khan. My pronouns are she, hers. I am the Director of Programs now at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. Really long name, so we go by APIGBV. It's easier, sometimes just API, sometimes just the Institute, whatever floats, your boat. We also, we are a culturally specific resource center. I'm so sure Shirley's going to touch on that. I am an immigrant mom. That's how I identify myself. I've been in this country about 25 years, and I've been doing the work to end gender-based violence for about 23. I fell into that role.
Hi everyone. My name is Shirley. I'm a program manager with APIGBV. I'm currently based in Lafayette, California. If you don't know where that is, it's like close to Walnut Creek, kind of in the East Bay. So just a little bit about us before we get started. APIGBV, or the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We're a national resource center, and we're based in Oakland, California, whatever that means, because currently we're completely remote, and most of us are in other states. Sarah and I happen to be 2 of only 4 staff working in Bay Area that even have access to our Oakland office. So we are a national resource center. We don't have any direct services, and our role is to really uplift the importance of culturally responsive advocacy for AAPI, Asian Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian survivors of gender-based violence, whether that's domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, elder abuse, female genital cutting, mutilation, just all these different forms of violence and abuses that show up in AAPI communities. We work with community-based organizations serving AAPI survivors throughout the country and throughout the U.S. territories. We also work with, systems, so like healthcare, judges, law enforcement, anybody who is interacting with survivors of violence or AAPI survivors of violence. And our role is to kind of build their capacity or build their, what's the new term, organizational resiliency to better support AAPI survivors. So we do a lot of training, we do technical assistance, we have reports, fact sheets, things like that, advocacy, policy advocacy. Maybe we should have worked this into the introduction, but we just want to hear a little bit from you guys before we get started. Why are you here with us today, and what are you hoping to learn, or what are you hoping to get out of?
We know you're here because of the grant, but if you have something to learn, what would that be? Anyone, any curiosity at all?
I think for me it would be understand the culture, how to connect with clients. Because I think for us going in and talking to people, you always want to be respectful, and you always, for me at least, working with the Hispanic community, I know it's very well and I feel comfortable in going to other cultures. I try to do the same respect, but I think you get a little bit nervous because you're not 100% secure of the culture. So I think for me it would be really understanding that and feeling like a hunter, like I could go and feel comfortable and understand that person and not just assume things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I want to agree with Liz as well, because I lived so many years in the American Canyon, so I know the diversity and just really to understand the culture of, because we're so used to working with the Latino population and stuff. And being in the American Canyon, I've seen a lot of stuff. But I also know it's not appropriate to walk up to somebody like in Walmart and like butt in or do I, or, so,
Yeah, that's helpful.
yeah.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Well, similar to what they said, what Elizabeth and Helen said, getting a sense of, especially with the GBV lens, kind of understanding barriers and needs that you as the institute kind of see across this population, and from our perspective, seeing how they may be similar or different to populations that we serve more regularly.
And I looked at your last annual report on your website, and it was primarily Latinx survivors, right? And then I didn't remember if there were any other ethnicities or populations that come in frequently, but and you serve Napa, but also American Canyon, just like the local cities, right?
So all of Napa County, so
All of
up
Napa
Valley
County.
too.
Okay. Any other things you wanted to get out of these 2 days? Not, open-mindedness is important too, so we can just move on. So, obviously, what you all named, we will definitely be talking about that, some of the trends we see in the community, some of the ways that violence shows up, and how culture impacts, someone's experience and someone's response to violence. And then we're gonna talk about culturally responsive services, how would you respond to an AAPI person who's experiencing violence? Like, would you just walk up to them and, in Walmart or something like that? Or, how might you learn about what they need in terms of support? And then also, lastly, we're gonna consider some approaches to kind of reaching out to the local AAPI community here, and engaging with them and letting them know, like, hey, we exist, we're here to help you, and these are, this is how you may be able to access our services, or here's what we can, do for you, just to kind of make that connection and that impact, because, one of the reasons that AAPI survivors may not be coming is maybe they don't know about you, or maybe they don't know that, your shelters or your services are open to them. And here is day 1. So we kind of broke it up in this way. We're talking about the AAPI community today, some of the cultural dynamics, some of the barriers that AAPI survivors face, and then some opportunities for culturally specific services. Day 2, we're talking more about kind of external things, language access, external is not the right word, but language access, immigration system, other systems, statistics, and underreporting and things like that will happen on day 2. But again, we're happy to shift things around if if there's something pressing on your mind, we can always do that too. So just a little bit of a reflection before we get into the kind of the presentation. Maybe just take a minute or so and think on this quietly. Think about a time that you made a cultural assumption about someone, and how that impacted the situation, or how that may have impacted them. Just reflect for about a minute or so. Yeah, I can share one. So the one that comes to mind is when I was in grad school. I had a good friend, and he was Black, and we were pretty good friends. And one day we were talking about just our experiences growing up, and I was saying things like, well, as an African American person, you may have experienced things like this, just various things. And he said, well, I'm Black, but my family is actually from Nigeria, so I don't really identify as the African American. My parents are African immigrants. And for me, that was a moment of like, oh, that's, I didn't even, in that moment, I didn't stop to think, well, just because this person is Black, he may not have had the same experiences that a lot of Black folks here have, because not all Black people in the U.S. are African Americans, or may identify as African Americans because they may be more recent immigrants. And so that was kind of like an internal like check-in moment for me. And he was very understanding, and he says he gets it a lot, but that was my cultural assumption. So part 2 of that question is, think of a time when someone else made a cultural assumption about you and how that may have made you feel, or how that may have impacted the situation, maybe how they responded.
I think it's easier to think about those because you don't always get the feedback on the people that you make assumptions about.
That's true.
That's gonna be my question, which one was easier to think of off the top of the bat?
Yeah.
Yeah, was that easier for you to think about, the second one? So, feel free to keep that to yourself, but if anybody wants to share what came to mind in one of these 2 questions? Yeah.
I was just going to say, this is sort of not making necessarily a cultural assumption about someone, or assuming everybody has the same culture as you.
Yeah.
And this, I always tell the story of, so I'm the shelter manager, and for years we always got a Thanksgiving meal kit, like a traditional kind of American, like turkey, mashed potatoes, that kind of thing. And I remember saying, like, I just don't know, our clients weren't really, a lot of our clients were Latina women, and sometimes nobody would actually use the food that we got, and I was like, what's that about? And I think my coworkers explained to me, like, a lot of people don't do turkey for Thanksgiving. They have other traditions. And so it just, like, oh my gosh, of course, like, I felt really silly for not having thought of that. And so we changed how we did it and asked the clients, like, how do you celebrate these holidays, or do you celebrate these holidays? And really catering it to them instead of just assuming, like, people are gonna do what your family does.
Yeah, that's a great anecdote, and I think sometimes it speaks to you could be doing this work for a long time, maybe 20 years, and still it's never too late to you're never beyond kind of needing to check in or needing to stop and think. Are you just are you making assumptions about someone, or are you not even thinking about what they may want, or what the culture that they're coming from, and if it makes sense for them. So there's always opportunities to learn. Anyone else want to share one of the 2? Sarah, do you want to share one?
Which one?
Either one.
No, oh my God, all the time. It is easy to think about when someone makes a cultural assumption about you. A simple one is, I am from India, or a small town in India. I usually don't identify as Indian, but everyone who hears that straight up goes namaste, which is fine. That's thank you to yoga and thank you to the cultural piece, but that's not my religion, that's not my area, that is not my identity. So I'll go back with namaste, but growing up, did I ever do namaste? Did I ever do folded hands? Never. So, so there's that, and then I've obviously made assumptions about folks. When I first started working as a program outreach coordinator, I used to do a lot of work with volunteers, and there was a volunteer who looked just like me, so I straight up assumed they were from India, and we were at an event. I think it was my first week at my job, and I switched to speaking in Hindi, which is a northern Indian language, and she was smiling and smiling, and at the end of the day I said something, and we were at a conference, I was talking, and she was just shaking her head, yes or no. I said, all right, fine. And at the end of the day, I said, Sweetie, what's the matter? And she goes, I was born and raised in Kenya. I can speak Gujarati, which is another language, which I think her parents gave to her, but I don't know how to speak Hindi at all. So I mean, if you would look at us, you would think we're the same people, but that was my entry into culture, is something from that person's point of view, however they look. So that was a wake-up call to not assume. There, I've shared it all about how I saw it over there.
Any other thoughts or reflections?
I think for me, one of the things is also like the assuming that like you go into a Hispanic household and that everyone has the same culture as you. Even though like for me, I broke so many of my like norms in my culture, right? And just being like first generation in the US and everything's completely different, and just going and assuming that like everyone has the same, like if they're Latino, they might have the same beliefs as you, or if they're Napa, they might just love wine as much as you do, kind of thing. Like, you know, so just like having that idea of meeting someone who is from the same state as you in Mexico or whatever, and you're already like assuming, oh my God, they love the same thing I do, or they're raised the same way, just the assumption.
Or even the difference across, like, I mean, hello, South America is so huge, right?
Right.
That was my wake-up reality call. I was doing outreach, and I learned the very hard way the difference between El Salvadorian versus Guatemalan versus Puerto Rican, and I was like, wait, everybody speaks Spanish, which is not something, the luxury that I had, but just even that, right?
But there's also like, you know, dialects and jargon, like little
Right.
things that are the same across, you know, all Spanish speakers. And I feel like in the US, people assume like if you're Hispanic or Latino, you're Mexican, and that's not always true.
I had a friend in college, she was Bolivian, and everywhere we would go, she would get so upset because they would ask her where she was from in Mexico. She's like, I'm Bolivian, I'm not Mexican. But it was just for her, it was, she'd gotten that like her whole life of people just assuming she was Mexican because she was Hispanic.
Right.
And interestingly, even though we work in the AAPI community, our language access work is national.
Right.
And so there's this always like, we're the ones like lifting up that, you know, the indigenous communities from Latin America speak languages other than Spanish, and that there needs to be, Spanish interpretation is fantastic, but there needs to be interpretation for these indigenous communities that are really not, you know, seen. So we end up doing that a lot as well.
And you almost get a lot coming from Napa, or at least this area, you know. I know, like, I was telling, you know, friends, coworkers, you know, we're doing a training in Napa, and they're like, what's in Napa? And you just, like, go there and drink wine and things like that. So I'm sure that's something you have experienced a lot.
Very much.
Or people like assume that you own a winery because you live in Napa.
Yeah.
It's like, no.
Everybody owns a winery. If only, right? Should we move? Yeah. So, okay, so who is the AAPI community? You know, what's hidden in these, you know, like 4 little terms, and sometimes you see AAPI, you say API, you see like AA and HPI, and I think now the official term is AA and PI. So it, you know, it changes, but who really is represented here? So we like to show this map because you can see just at a glance how wide and how broad the AAPI community is. I don't know if you can read the, you know, the things, but you know, that's okay. You can see right off the bat how many different you know, backgrounds and languages are represented in the AAPI community. And, you know, identity is one of those things that's a little bit of a, you know, it's self-selected, it's a little bit of a gray area. For instance, do like Filipino individuals, do they identify as Asians or do they identify as Pacific Islanders? And I've known, you know, Filipino folks who
You think of someone that looks like me, which would be from South Asia, from one of those countries. So even within the Asian communities, there's that East Asian versus South Asian, or like we say, lighter skin versus browner skin, like thank you colonialism. So we have a lot of that hanging in there. And then in the US Census, West Asia, as it's called, which is, that is not even considered a part of the Asian community, because technically the Arabs and the West Asian countries, they originated from the Caucasian mountains, so technically they are white, but in this country, they're not treated as white, even though they're supposed to go by that. So there's a lot of nuances and complications.
Yeah.
So yeah.
A lot of complications. Yeah, so it's like East Asia, then Central West Asia, where like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Middle East, Northern Africa, and then you have South Asia here, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, and then in the orange there's the Pacific Islands like Samoa, Tonga, Micronesia, yeah. So as you can see, a lot of ethnicities, a lot of backgrounds, a lot of religions, a lot of cultures, a lot of languages, foods. Yeah. So, some working assumptions that we want to hold as we, proceed through these 2 days is that all cultures, including AAPI cultures, including, American cultures, or Latinx cultures, have values that are oppressive, but they also have things that are empowering and nurturing. So culture and community are both sources of harm and sources of restrictions and limitations, but they can also be very powerful sources of support and healing, and often both at once. Each individual is not only a member of their community, but a unique individual with their own responses and their own beliefs and values. So that's, I think you shared earlier about how, you may not identify with all the values or the traditions of your culture. Just because you're from a culture doesn't mean you have all the same beliefs or you practice the same, responses or practice the same practices. And lastly, it would be impossible for us or anybody to fully describe the diversity and nuances of AAPI culture. So we're not here today to say like Asians are this, this, and this, and next time you meet an Asian person, you'll know that they're this, this, and this. It's just kind of to give you very broad strokes of some of the things that you'll see in a lot of AAPI cultures, but still, approach each person as an individual, each situation as unique, and that sort of thing. So, challenging internal biases. So here you'll see a lot of, I think a lot of these assumptions aren't very, probably won't be very new to you. They're a part of stereotype perpetuated by media and everything like that. So you've probably heard that Asian women are submissive, and that might lead you encountering an Asian person who's saying, I'm experiencing violence from my partner. You might say like, well, I thought if Asian women are submissive, or males or men are supposed to be heads of household and have more power in a relationship, then isn't it normal for you to be more submissive? Or maybe it's normal for the abuse to happen. We've known folks who even encountered situations like that, where they're going into a service agency, and the response is, well, I thought that's normal in your culture for your husband to be more controlling of you, right? And that's obviously, it's never okay. AAPI parents thank their children, and at least from my experience growing up and my friends, we did have experiences with, physical punishment, just like slap on the wrist or with a ruler or something like that, and that can be very normal. But you don't want that to let you ignore potential cases of family violence or child abuse, because you're thinking, well, it's normal for a Chinese child to be spanked as a kid. AAPI families are tight-knit, and that's, for the most part, it's true. There's a lot of collectivism that happens in our communities, but at the same time, you don't want to let that make you assume that you can just send a survivor to be with her family or his family and they're going to be automatically safe with that family. AAPIs respect their elders, and I think that's for, in a lot of AAPI cultures, there's traditions of deference to elders, and like respect for elders, but abuse does happen to AAPI elders. Children neglect or mistreat their elderly parents, or elders might be survivors of violence, like partner violence. So we don't want to assume just because this person's an elder, well, they're getting all the respect, they must never be experiencing abuse, right? And then lastly, AAPIs are all about communities. And like I talked about, while there is a lot of collectivism in these cultures, that doesn't mean that the community is always protective, and that doesn't mean the community is always supportive. So all that to say, there's a lot of, kind of assumptions and kind of general, whether or not they are often true, doesn't mean you want to let that kind of cloud your approach to an AAPI person who's experiencing abuse, or who may be. So, I apologize, this is probably
I
too
don't know
small.
how to make it too bigger.
Yeah,
But
no.
we obviously will share this, and you might already have this data, but we're happy to share this.
Yeah. So, if you can see, here is the data for Napa County, and it says, it's talking about the total API population in 2019. So in Napa County, 8% of the API were Chinese, 7% were Indian, and then 49% were Filipino. And then obviously that doesn't add up to 100. So I think what often happens is, some populations are kind of too small to be statistically significant, which is unfortunately that happens a lot for, some AAPI communities, too small to be statistically significant. But I know that there's a Chinese, Indian, Filipino, there's some Vietnamese folks, some Thai, and other mixes. And if you know, if you have better info or better data, let me know who are the AAPI folks that live around here, that work around here. So Gina was very helpful in our conversations with her in setting up some conversations with local AAPI community members, AAPI community leaders. So we were able to learn a little bit about your population here, especially the Filipino and the Thai community in Napa County. And this is what we heard from them. So they let us know that it's a fairly new community with roots in Vallejo. So there's a pretty large AAPI population in Vallejo, and in recent years a lot of them have moved out to Napa County. A lot of them live in American Canyon. A lot of them still work in Vallejo or elsewhere, often in the medical field, and just live around here. There's multi-generational families, so you have grandparents or parents who immigrated, and then most children or younger generations tend to have grown up here. There are issues with acculturation, so the grandparents or the parents, I think what this person specifically said was grandparents tend to still practice a lot of the same cultures, still hold a lot of the same values and beliefs and things like that from their home culture and their home country. Parents often are more, assimilated or more acculturated to American culture, and a lot of times there's a clash between the parents and the grandparents, with the parents, leaning more Western. Often the children are then caught in the middle between the two, with the grandparents saying, well, you need to do this, and the parents saying, well, we're in America. That doesn't make sense here. So, as you see in a lot of multi-generational families, the cultures differ across the generation lines. And then because it is a very small community of AAPI, Filipino community, it tends to be very tight-knit. So a lot of folks know a lot of folks.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is if you're newly arrived or you're bringing in newer folks, whether they are from your family or from your country, I know that is how most migration in my family started. One person came here and then more uncles and aunts and cousins started joining them, and also to find a job. I speak as an immigrant. I don't know if I necessarily would be friends with my community that I have here now if I was back home. Because it's a whole bunch of different peoples, but the identity, and also, frankly, when I came, my partner and I were having fun and roaming around. It's only after we had a child, we were like, oh, you know, our children need to understand the culture, the language, where we come from to keep it going. And so then now we have this huge community, which is growing by leaps and bounds. But I sometimes do think, I'm like, would we even know them if we really were back home? So there's that also. I think that's why it also becomes tight-knit. It also means if you are religious, you're going to the same church, then you kind of keep falling in the same places.
And a lot of times, I don't know if this is true of the communities in Napa County, but I know with AAPI immigration, a lot of times folks from the same village or city end up kind of in the same place in the US. And that's part of why a lot of folks will know each other. I think it happens like through word of mouth, one family immigrates to a city in the US and then others follow them because they hear about the first family. So a lot of people may know each other back home and also in the US. Yeah, I mean, if there's anything, if you all living in Napa, if you know more about the community or certain things that you've encountered, please shout it out. So we're going to be talking about gender-based violence. I mean, I'm sure you all know this, this picture or this image. We're talking about gender-based violence in the context of especially today, AAPI cultures and AAPI communities. The first thing that's kind of important to talk about is the historical context of generational trauma, generational oppression that a lot of AAPI communities in the US have experienced, often in the home country and then often in the process of coming to the US or in the US itself. So colonization, of course, as happened in the Pacific Islands, as happened in India, as happened in a lot of places, can lead to today continued fetishization. I always have trouble with that word, and exotification of women, and sometimes men and girls. Colonizing and then saying, well, they're exotic, or the traditional values, the traditional practices are beautiful and exotic. And often that leads to kind of suppressing of traditional cultures, traditional beliefs that may be healing, that may be sources of comfort, that may be sources of support, for assimilating into the mainstream US culture. So for instance, Native Hawaiians, we did a listening session in Hawaii a couple of years ago and heard from Native Hawaiian advocates that a lot of them had parents and grandparents that grew up not being allowed to speak Hawaiian, because if they were to speak Hawaiian, they would get publicly humiliated just in the streets, sometimes publicly beaten and punished for speaking their language, and the silencing that creates across generations of we're just gonna bottle it up and hold it in and be American. If you think about the harms that passes through the generations when something like that happens. State violence and civil war. So a lot of communities in the home country have experienced violence from the state. So the militia, the military. Sometimes that's in cases of civil war, too, violence at the hands of law enforcement, violence at the hands of the military. So that leads to a lot of distrust in the military, in the government, in systems. In cases of civil war and state violence, we've seen a lot of rape being used as a tool of war, and not just as a consequence, not just as a side effect, but used as an intentional tool, intentional practice to create fear and to create, fear and threat among the population to keep them in control. And then displacement and refugee resettlement. So a lot of communities have come here as refugees after being displaced by, maybe state violence or maybe civil war. For instance, the Vietnamese communities, the Hmong, Cambodians, and then most recently the Afghan community. And a lot of times it's not just, they're displaced and then they come here, right? They go to a refugee camp in the home country, maybe they go to a refugee camp in a third country, maybe they come here, there's a refugee camp, maybe there's another refugee camp. So it can be often a long process to get to resettlement, and a lot of times they may experience violence along the process of resettlement. So there's a lot of historical and generational trauma that show up in AAPI communities in the U.S.
That we may not always talk about. And do we have any Afghan refugees or any refugees, other communities outside of the Filipino communities that anyone has come across?
I know that there have been some Afghans who have been resettled here through churches after it gets pretty small though.
Oh, good to know.
I mean, I know that there's a significant Hmong community in Sacramento,
Right.
which isn't that close. I'm like,
No.
where am I?
I was like, no.
Okay.
I'm just lifting that up. If you do come across someone from the Afghan community, happy to help with language as well. Or put you in touch with language access. Not, we won't do it, we don't do direct service, sorry. But if you need materials and stuff, we're happy to look that up.
So this was shared by a participant at our listening session that I talked about, and they talked about how kind of, historical trauma has rippled through the generations, not only affecting the people who directly experienced it, but their relationships with their children, their relationships with their children's children. These are communities that a lot of times multi-generational, right? So the grandparents teach the parents teach the children. There are certain practices and beliefs that pass through the generations. But when that silencing happens, when that disruption and that violence happens, those types of healthy learnings are not being passed through, and instead it's being replaced by a cycle of violence, like passing along the cycle of abuse, right? Passing along harms and hurts. And that's something that a lot of advocates are striving to change, is to rebuild connection to culture and rebuild connection to traditions that are healing and hopeful. So you've probably all heard the term collectivism. I think it can probably describe, I'm not very familiar with Latinx communities, but I think I've heard folks say that Latinx communities, Hispanics communities are also very collective. And that's also true for AAPI communities. Most AAPI communities would describe themselves, I think, as collective. But we wanted to unpack a little bit, what does collectivism mean? So I've heard folks describe collectivism as self, yourself supposed to give way to the wants and the values of the family, to the collectivism of the family. So you're not supposed to put what you want, your own self, above the wants of your family. And I've also heard collectivism being described as your own family, so a family unit versus the community. So your family is supposed to give way, or to put themselves of lower importance compared to the well-being of the community. So there's kind of a lot of layers to collectivism. I think just like culture, just like many aspects of culture, collectivism is a source of harm and strength. A lot of folks find a lot of healing, a lot of nurturing, and support in their family or in their community. But at the same time, a lot of times your family and your community can turn on you when you're experiencing violence, or when you don't follow along the lines of their expectations, when you deviate from what they expect of you or what they want from you.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you, I don't know if anyone here had to learn this, but when I came here and I took a training, I was asked to speak in the terms of saying I instead of we. I don't know, like, or switching to English, like, you know, using I statements. Like, I feel this way, and I feel, which is still very hard for me to do. So one day, my sister, my mom, and I, transnational, were having this conversation, and I was trying to explain to them about how I felt about this whole situation and how my feelings were impacted. I thought I was doing fantastic, like things that I was learning. At the end of it, my mom goes, I, is that all you can talk about? Why are you not, and this is in another language, sounds different, but literally, it was like, why are you saying I? Like, what about us? What about us as collective? And so, trying to switch, there's already, for pretty much folks that are bilingual, bicultural, right? There's code switching. You're switching languages, you're thinking in one language, you're speaking in another language, and then you're trying to find ways to do that. I bring that to say there's us living our normal lives, and if it's without violence, there's still so many things happening in it. And so if you're working with a survivor who's dealing with so many things, the assumption that they would be, you know, comfortable using I statements and putting themselves before family is not necessarily going to happen. And collectivism, I was in New York on 9/11, and all I saw it was be a source of harm, because the community was telling folks, I used to volunteer, and if you dressed a certain way, if you looked of a certain faith, or basically Muslims, people were hurting. So the advocates and the court personnel were not very nice to someone that was wearing a hijab. But then also the community was like, this is the least of your problems right now, right? You don't want this person to be deported. You don't want this person to put in detention. We don't want to bring attention to our community, which is already facing a whole bunch of negative attention. So I feel in that way, collectivism was certainly a source of harm to those that were most marginalized.
And I've heard advocates say, you know, we had a conversation around consent and what does consent mean in, you know, in AAPI cultures and communities, and folks would say, you know, consent is about establishing your personal boundaries and your individual beliefs, your personal beliefs and your personal wants against someone else. Well, that doesn't make sense in our culture, because if you're doing that, if you're saying these are my boundaries, this is what I want, that's selfish, right? And that's something that's it's disrespectful in some situations, depending on who the other person is, and it's a selfish thing. And if it's a selfish thing, then it's a shameful thing. Shame is something we're going to talk about also later. A lot, yeah. It's something that shows up a lot and is used a lot against survivors. So, again, you know, painting with some really very broad strokes here, but I think a lot of these things hold true across many AAPI cultures and communities that we've worked with in the past. Gender roles, right? So masculine virtues, you know, if you're a male, if you're a boy or a man, you're expected to be decisive, you're expected to be strong, you're expected to have control and take charge. And it's okay if you're a little bit bossy, it's okay if you're a little bit forceful, because that's just what it is to be a man and to be what is it, macho, machismo, right? To be masculine, right? Feminine. So if you're a girl, if you're a woman, you're expected to be gentle, to be kind. My dad used to say lovely. I think it was something maybe lost in translation, but he would say, like, you know, why aren't you more lovely? And I think he was probably meaning kind of like gentle, accommodating.
Oh my gosh, you're already so gentle.
I think so. I think. Right, but you know, like warm. You're supposed to be nurturing, like the motherly qualities, feminine qualities, right? A lot of cultures have a male head of household, and that male head of household is, you know, first of all, the father or the grandfather, the patriarch of the family. When a woman gets married, it's the husband, and then when the husband, if the husband passes away, it's her sons, right, or sometimes her brothers. And pureness is expected, especially of women, much less of men. You're expected to be pure. You're expected to be chaste. Virginity, of course. You don't have sex before you're married. Right. You're as a girl, as a woman, you're expected to be pure. And then the question is, what happens if you're a man who isn't decisive, who doesn't have those like traditional manly kind of traits, right? What happens if you're a woman who isn't? What happens if you identify as neither a woman or a man, if you're in between? And how would your family expect you to behave then? Or would they even be okay with that? What happens if you're a woman and you're not pure? So in terms of family dynamics, families are often very tight-knit, and that means that boundaries are often blurred. So a lot of children will share stories about how their parents just walks into their room, doesn't knock, doesn't ask permission, just comes into the room, asks nosy questions. A lot of parents will say like, well, if you're you have to do this, this, and this with your life, right? Folks have shared that since the moment they were born, their life was basically like planned out for them. Talk about a brooch of boundaries, right?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because of the whole knocking and walking into the room. I don't think I ever had a door closed.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I find it so alien, but anyways.
I thought it was funny too
Okay,
because
thank
it
you.
reminded me when I was growing up back we didn't have cell phones, right? So people used to call your house. But my dad would answer and they would ask for me. He would be like, "Oh, what do you want her for?" And my mom would be like, "If they want to talk about a boyfriend, they're not gonna be telling you like what they want her for."
Yeah.
But it was like his thing. He would always be like, "Hey," or like, "Someone, is Elizabeth there?" Like, "Yeah, she's here. What do you want to talk to her about?" Like, but it was just him
Talk to me
like
instead.
saying, or like, "Well, why is your door locked? Like, why? What are you doing there?" You know,
Right.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it was funny.
Yeah, total lack of boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, that's completely true. Like, no doors closed. Sometimes like you live in the same room as your sister, your brother, your parent, so there are no doors to close. There are no doors to lock. Relationships are hierarchical, and deference and obedience is expected if you're not someone with power. So usually it's the children, young children who don't have any power. Wives often don't have any power. The husbands have power. If you're not married in some cultures, that means you don't have any power because you're not seen to be like an adult yet. If you're not married, like the trope of the red packages, the red envelopes that you get on Chinese or Lunar New Year.
Oh yeah.
The moment, so if you are unmarried, you receive a red package. If you are married, you're expected to be the person who gives. And, I think that comes from, if you're married, then you're an adult now, A lot of times in certain cultures, when you're married, you do gain more power in the community because you're seen as an elder. You're seen as kind of fulfilling what you're meant to do. So you do have that respect. And I know in some communities, so I've talked to Pacific Islander advocates who say, you can invite us to a focus group, you can invite us to a listening session, but if there are older people in the room, then we're not going to speak up because we're supposed to let them speak up. And by older, this is from people like in their 50s and their 40s. Friends would say, like, my dad is in the Philippines, or my dad is going back to the Philippines this summer, going for 6 months. My uncle is there right now, so there's a lot of like time splitting between here and the home country too.
And even, I'm thinking everyone here, maybe, I'm projecting and making it like really big. Because of the internet, because like I feel like our world has become smaller in the sense that it's so much easier to communicate with people in other countries. so that people are also more aware than what about folks that came in the 60s or the 70s, right? To be connected to a home country was that much harder than it is now. It's just through the phone or through WhatsApp or whatever other app you use to connect. And I feel like that makes a huge difference as well of holding on to the cultural piece that you would not have done, like in the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay, should I go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Marriage is seen in many cultures as something that's of utmost importance, like I talked about. You know, if you're a girl, then your job is to get married and have children. A lot of times you're not seen as whole or complete or fulfilling your kind of like spiritual mission and purpose if you're not married, especially if you're a woman. Once you're married, it's seen as the wife's job, often to keep the family together. And if there's something happening with the family, family dynamics, if there's abuse in the family, if the children aren't happy, if the children aren't successful, then that's a reflection upon the wife often, because you know it's seen as her purview, right? Her role is the household and the family, and that's why a lot of times you'll see like survivors don't want to leave the family because it's their role. They see it as if they're leaving the family, then you know it's their fault, right? And often you'll see that when a survivor, if she's a woman, like a survivor of domestic violence, does reach out for support, for help from healthcare, from service providers, the people who will turn on her, the people who will blame her, are her own family, not just her husband's family, but her own family. So her cousins, her aunts, her mother, her grandmother, and it often is the female relatives that will that kind of cast this judgment or this shame. So another dynamic is that you don't talk about sex and you don't talk about relationships. These are subjects that are very private. It's very embarrassing for somebody to talk to somebody outside of their, kind of their relationship, about that relationship, about sex. As a young person, you're definitely not supposed to have sex until you're married. You're not supposed to date and you're not supposed to have sex until you're married. And what happens then is a lot of children never learn from their parents what is a healthy relationship. A lot of children don't even learn from their parents what is sex and how do you have sex. So I spoke to an advocate who spoke about these women that have come to her support groups, and she was sharing about how these women were told, like, you can't have sex, you don't talk about sex. It was treated as this like big thing, right? Like this big scary thing. And so she never really knew what it was. When she got married, on the wedding night, she knew she was expected to have sex, but because it had become this huge thing in her life, it was filled with like fear. She was scared of it because her whole life it was like, don't do that. So she didn't know what it was. She was scared, but she still felt like she needed to, and her husband wanted to. So they did end up having sex, but she didn't like it because she was scared and first time, and that clouded her perspective, her viewpoint on sex for the rest of the marriage. She never learned to like it. It was always this like scary thing that she felt obligated to participate in for her husband. And she never, she never even thought about it in those terms until she talked to this advocate.
I think if you do come across children, teens, that is a huge place where you'll find someone for teen dating violence, because the person that they're having a relationship with holds that up against them, right? That if you don't do whatever, I'm going to tell your parents, right? So there's that extra threat of blackmail. And if you're in a same-sex relationship, same thing, because now you have that power over that person, and we know that's exactly why it happens. So we are seeing a lot more in the younger, children, because obviously they're doing what everyone else is doing in school. So
Yeah, and Asian and Pacific Islander children do have sex and they do date. They often just don't tell their parents, and if they're experiencing violence, then a lot of times they don't feel safe telling their parents because they're like, well, what if my parent punishes me or grounds me? So a lot of times you see like young folks who are experiencing violence don't want to reach out for help because they're scared it'll get back to their parents. They're scared that, you know, not only because they were dating, but they might, if something happened at a party, for instance, they might be afraid their parents will say, well, were you drinking? Did you smoke? Were you doing drugs?
Why were you at the party?
Why were you at the party? Yeah. So is this our last slide in this section? We can put a break after this.
Is this? Oh, there's barriers. Yes, I guess. Okay.
So again, I think it's pretty small, but this is an infographic called The Lifetime Spiral of Violence that we developed after several conversations with communities, specifically in India, right? But I think a lot of AAPI communities do resonate with this lifetime spiral. The lifetime spiral basically names different types of violence, gender-based violence, that AAPI folks can experience throughout the course of their life. And the reason it's a spiral is because, you know, a lot of times abuse can start the moment somebody is born. Because AAPI cultures, many of them value boys, so that, you know, the girl children are often mistreated. A lot of times, I mean, sex-selected abortion, you know, parents may abort a child if they find out she's a female, she's a girl, and they only want a boy. So it can actually start before they're born. And these abuses can carry throughout the course of their life, from when they're a child, when they're a teenager, all the way through an elder. A lot of times these abuses, you know, there's co-occurrence with one another. A lot of times there's more than one person who's doing the harm. And a lot of times, if somebody experienced something earlier in their life, it may cause them, they may be more likely to experience something later in their life too. So this is all on our website, but since it's too small to see, maybe I'll just read out some of the ones here. There's sex-selected abortion, malnourishment or undernourishment by withholding nutritious food, withholding medical care, especially for girl children, incest, sexual abuse, child prostitution, little or no schooling, especially for girl children, forced marriage, often to a much older man, ignorance about sex, autonomy and sexual health, cyber stalking, dating violence, harassment, denied choice of marriage partner or denied sexual orientation and identity, dowry-related deaths. And then we have denying mothers access or custody to children, international abduction and kidnapping, intimate homicide. Let's see. Forced into unprotected sex, economic abuse, coerced into criminal activity, obviously domestic violence, violence by fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers-in-law, and male family members, withholding health care, withholding medication and daily necessities, demeaning widowhood, coerced suicide pacts, or mercy killings.
How common do you see forced marriage here in the Bay?
In the Bay Area, do you know, Sarah?
Yes, it used to be more common before, where it's basically, in my experience working in my previous job, it was primarily children who were born here are forced to marry men, mostly women here, were forced to marry men in the home countries to bring them here for business and things like that. I think that was more forced marriage. It's that pattern of bringing in someone from your village or culture, basically citizenship. So yeah, so we actually have a group, a forced marriage group, nationally that works on forced marriage, not just in the AAPI community, but also in the African community, and actually here in the US as well, because Utah has the highest rate of child marriages, which is within the Caucasian community.
I was just curious, when I was in LA, I had a lot of friends who were, from Asian and like Indian, and I know for them it wasn't necessarily like forced to get married from like a particular person, but more like culture, like even within, I had a friend who was Indian, like even her husband, her husband, because her family was having such a hard time because he was a different culture, and that was so common in LA. And so I didn't know how common this was here.
But I don't know if it was it forced marriage or
No,
was
it wasn't.
arranged marriage? There's a difference.
It was more like arranged
Yeah.
marriage, but that's why I wanted to know about the forced marriage, like how common is that?
It is, I think, more common in England than it is. Well, again, it comes down to, we'll talk a little bit more about underreporting. And I do want to make one clarification about the lifetime spiral. We started this in the 80s and the 90s, right? So a lot of things have changed. And what it doesn't talk about, this is real. The lifetime spiral of violence against women, which is where it is definitely there. But it also stems from the fact that these are people oftentimes who are really poor. So then the culture piece of it is what Shirley was talking to, which is definitely lifting up the male child, but that is lifting up the male child not just because they are male, but the assumption is that they're going to take care of you when you are older, because that's the collective piece of it, right? So, I mean, if you just look at things just by themselves, then it's all terrible, right? And oh my gosh, so savage. But if you look at it in the context of money and culture of then if they are giving no schooling, because I mean, let's say my sibling and I, if I get to go to school, the understanding is not that my mom will live with me because I'm supposed to be married and gone away, right? My mom will, or my parents will live with my brother and his family, and they will take care of him. So who needs to be taken care of? Who needs to get education? I think that is the piece. And the prostitution, which totally broke my heart, but it happens oftentimes is for food, right? And so, yeah. So I think it's that as well.
Question, just something isn't really reconciling in my brain. We talked about the women the girls needing to be so chaste, and then we're talking about molestation and rape and sexual abuse of infants, children, and teenagers. What happens to that child in their reputation or their value as a human to their family?
Well, it's not talked about, right? If a child is experiencing these things as a child, nobody's talking about it. The child is usually not talking about it with their parents often until later in life. And I think that's just how it is. And I think a lot of times the forced marriage happens when the child is molested or raped. Then it's said, well, you've lost your pureness now. Well, how do we fix you? Well, the only person is the person who did this to you. Right?
You're oftentimes even married to a rapist, but in those cases, what Shirley is saying is right? If it's incest and teasing, it's not spoken about, so it doesn't happen.
So if it's
So
not
people don't
spoken
know.
about, so nobody really knows, but if they did know, what happens to that male or that person that did commit those crimes, since men are
To the male?
Yeah.
A lot of times it's just brushed under the rug, right? It's kind of like, just forget about it, especially if they have power within the community or that family has power within the community. You just brush it under the rug and you don't talk about it. Yeah.
And when you say that community, do you mean here in the States or back home?
Both.
In the home country?
Both, yeah.
Both?
It could be anywhere, and it actually could be any community. I mean, if you work with with children of child sexual abuse survivors here, it's the same. Like, and especially if it's by a family member, nobody really comes out and speaks about it. Because what's going to happen, like you're going to put a 12-year-old on trial and say, explain what happened. So there's silence here, regardless of whether they're Asian or not, or whoever it is. I think children always face the worst of it.
I think if a child is, molested by a family member, it's, you don't talk about it, right? The family member, the male person, if it's found out, they may be kind of shamed, humiliated, and things like that, but so will the child. And it'll be one of those things where it's kind of like whispered, like you see her, you're like, did you know this happened to her? Did you know that this, she's this way? And then nobody will want to marry her. She's considered like unwanted.
So when it comes to domestic violence, do most people in the community stay because, like you said, mostly they get blamed from like their own family and culture, as well as you married this person, now you have to just deal with it and we're gonna keep it under the rug.
That's a big part of it. I mean, a lot of marriages, once you're married, you belong to, for girls, once you're married, you belong to your husband's family. That's kind of what Sarah was talking about. When you're older, your male children take care of you, but your female children are taking care of their husband's family. So that's part of it. And part of it's because you don't speak out because you know how your family is going to react. You know that everywhere you go, people are just going to see you as, that person who was abused by her husband and then left the husband. You know that nobody's going to want to marry you again because you're seen as, damaged. Someone said earlier, unwanted.
Yeah, I think it's so hard with our clients too. A lot of people just go like, why don't they leave? Why don't they leave? And I think a lot of people don't realize that leaving a domestic violence is not just leaving your partner. It's also dealing with your own family, getting that support from that community. Yeah. Even support groups. You go to a support group and it might be in Spanish, but it's like, do they understand your culture? Is that person that's like helping you can understand that part? And it just becomes hard.
Are we taking a break or can I
sorry.
say
Well,
something? I was going to say something and then I was
No,
like,
go
okay,
ahead.
it might be a monologue. So that's why
I was
like,
going to say we'll take questions, then we'll take a break. So go
Okay.
ahead.
So there's definitely this piece. I feel that not that you have a shelter, appreciate shelters, we've used shelters our whole life. I'm not necessarily sure it works for communities. And by communities, I mean communities of color. When you're asking someone to leave, and you ask someone to leave in the 60s, even in the 70s, that person primarily could have been someone who was white. You go out for a little while, 30 days is enough to help you to come back, to gather support. When we talk about our communities, when you're asking them to leave, a 30-day in a shelter is helpful, is very helpful. But the actual work starts after that, right? It's like, what if it's immigration? What if it's children? And you're asking someone to leave, you're not just asking someone to leave the volatile experience that you're having at home. It's finance. If I'm working, maybe my mother-in-law is taking care of my kids, right? You're telling me to literally leave my church. You're asking me to leave not just the relationship or the house, you're asking me to leave a lot of surrounding support system, which is what I need to work and thrive. And oftentimes, and I'm sure it's just like preaching to the choir, the DV piece of it or the sexual assault piece of it doesn't come out till way much later. The DV piece of it is also maybe not the first thing that people talk about, at least did not talk about. They were kind of like pushed into that. It was always housing, it was always school, it was also immigration. It was, what do I do with my parents? Because I can't even take care of them till I get, whatever help. So I feel like we need to see some of the surrounding areas and shifting the narrative from why doesn't she leave to like, what would it need for them to be self-sufficient enough to then not put up with the abuse?
And even for the sexual assault, I had recently a client from the Asian community, and she was sexually assaulted at a church in American Canyon, and they kind of mom was kind of like forcing her, because she's a minor, if I would say force, to apologize to the guy, because then that meant they would lose their church. And the police officer was really upset. It was like, you cannot have her apologize. But then also, for me, it was like, well, stop a minute before saying that, because you also have to see the culture and maybe talk to mom in a way that's like different, and for her to understand situations. So that's, like you said, there's just more than that.
Yes, and also I feel like sometimes you just have to put your foot down. Like it was like, I think you were saying, I think understand the culture. There is the piece of we can never understand anyone's culture completely enough. But what you know is an elder assaulting a child is wrong. Doesn't matter what culture it is. Yes, the mom asking to apologize is wrong, but yes, the mom may have reasons, but who wants to go back to that church? Not that child. But that mom might, because we also know, unfortunately, religious institutions are the first place for like gossip, for putting you down, and the whole collectivism that comes from there, right? So.
Yeah. And mom was like, almost when the whole thing came out, she was the one that was almost getting, like you said.
Yeah.
It's like you're
right.
the best one.
You're the one who brought this attention to the church.
To our church. So she's the one that was getting.
And it was been your upbringing, this person, this gentleman, and I use that word very sarcastically, why was only your daughter? Right? I mean, it always ends up being on the mom. I think that's the stress that ends up
happening. And for me, it was kind of how do I support this mom when I have different beliefs too, and and the culture is similar to the Hispanic culture, but it's like I didn't want to say something for her to feel like I'm also pushing her away, and it was just trying to understand that part.
I don't want to simplify it enough, but every time I am with my friends that are my Latina friends, it's like, oh my God, are you just talking about your family or my family? Right? So I don't want to simplify, but I also realize that a lot of our cultures, and especially folks that migrate at certain times, like that thing, of course there are differences, but there are also a lot of similarities. And like, Shirley, we're both Asian. Her culture is so different from mine. But if you look at someone who looks exactly like Shirley, but is like maybe 5 years younger than her and born and raised in Louisiana, even though they're Asian, even though they're born in America, just like Shirley is in San Jose, their cultures would be poles apart, right? And I say that all the time, like when people say American culture, I'm like, what American culture? Like, are you talking about someone who's born in Maine versus someone born in Utah versus someone born wherever? And was it rural? Was it urban? What languages do they speak? So I think you have to come at it from that point of view. That's always my culture 101.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're happy to take other questions before we move on. Or reflections.
Or you could go on break, or you could grab coffee.
Well, if you give them that option, they're gonna be like, oh, we wanna go on break.
No, they can stay and stretch.
Yeah.
No, they might be like, no, we love what Shirley's saying, we're not gonna go. I don't know, what do you all wanna do?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say reflection is something that Sarah mentioned is as you're all going through this, and sometimes I catch myself like kind of like laughing or or smiling internally because I'm like I relate so much to the exact examples of how I see that portrayed in my family, being first generation, coming from same thing, parents migrating here from Mexico and all of that stuff, and being one of the oldest in my family as far as grandkids. So seeing all of those things and just the reflection being that there's a lot of things that yes overlap or are very similar to what we're seeing within our own cultures. And a lot of us I think here are not only bilingual but also bicultural as well. So I'm sure that there's other people that I also see kind of smiling with certain things that we can relate in a lot of aspects, but definitely can see that there's differences.
I've seen a lot of like nodding, a lot of smiling, yeah. it seems like a lot of folks can't relate. And I think a lot of times AAPI survivors, sometimes they, if there's no API shelter or service provider in the area, they may choose to go to a Hispanic serving organization because the cultures are in a lot of ways so similar. Sometimes they don't want to go to an API place because, again, everybody knows everybody. So it's like, am I gonna know the advocate? Am I gonna know the volunteer working there? So maybe I'll go to this, Hispanic serving.
And it's small things, like I remember at our transitional home, it was obviously open to everyone. So when a Latina lady would come in with her children, she'd be so happy to see something as silly as like, oh, it's okay to remove shoes outside, or like the house smells of like certain spices, or things like that, which you worry about, right? With the whole switching that you have to do every single time. So we've definitely seen that. Anything that came up, like in terms of, because this was really very broad, right? You saw all the cultures, like anything that comes up, if not for today, for tomorrow, that you want us to speak a little bit more about, or ideas that you might want to have, we're happy to do that.
It's broad, but it's also very relatable, and the fact that in our department we work with young people, so they're middle school and high school aged, and one of the communities that we serve is an American Kenyan, and so we do have clients that are part of the AP community, and so we're working with young people that are facing the world that they're currently living in, plus the one that they live at home with their culture and ancestors, and their parents wanting to live through them, and then also facing domestic violence and sexual abuse, and just trying to remember all of this, but also coming from a place of, you are the advocate, you are here to provide compassion and support for this young person and what their needs might look like. And sometimes, it does get kind of sad because you are the only person that is their ally and their support system. Right. But it's also very rewarding, and just seeing them light up and being empowered by whatever it is that they feel they need, and then taking those steps to access it. So it's tough sometimes.
It is very tough, and thank you for doing what you're doing. I'm very happy to. My goal is not to walk away. Shirley's looking at me like, what is she going to drop? My goal is not to walk away from here and you all thinking like I suck. But these are what I call my fabulous flops, right? So back in the days, in 2000s, I was doing this teen dating violence thing at India Community Center, and one of my questions of empowerment was like, how many of you are in a relationship? Nobody was in a relationship. And later on, what was I asking? Who's ever going to say that they're in a relationship, right? Or how many of you know blah, blah, blah? Nothing. Do you know what power and control is? I was so Americanized. Finally, next time around, not a single answer, not one person lifted their head. And again, remember, I'm an immigrant, so to me, I'm like, oh, so disrespectful. Right? So then I ended up talking to one of the young volunteers, and she was like, do you want me to lead this session? Yes, please do. So she did, and she goes, how many of you know of someone in a relationship and that they're being, that might be hurtful? Every hand in the room went up. Oh my God, okay. So that was obviously one of my big lessons, that people will talk to folks that they relate to, but also you have to ask the right questions. So to say that, so maybe you can even be do you know of anybody who is in an abusive relationship, versus, or what do you think you want us to do, or things like that.
And always feel free to get up, move around if you want. Any residual questions that we didn't catch before break? We'll give some time at the end too for questions. So let's talk about some barriers to help seeking. We talked a little bit about them before break, even they were coming up. But what is kind of preventing AAPI people experiencing abuse from reaching out for help? And so today we're going to be mostly talking about the barriers that are coming from culture and coming from community. We're not gonna be talking too much about like systems barriers today. We'll talk about that tomorrow more. So this is like from the culture, from the community, what is in the way. So, I mean, I think the first of it is that, you know, what's captured in this quote here, which says that I didn't have a sense of there being other Asian survivors. It was a non-conversation among Asian communities that I know. So I feel like growing up, at least in my experience, I grew up in San Jose, which has a very significant Chinese, Indian, Filipino, and Vietnamese community. It was something that, so violence, domestic violence, family violence, were things that everybody kind of knew about, not necessarily in those terms. But a lot of people, like Sarah said earlier, knew somebody who, you know, my friend's family, her dad, you know, hits her mom sometimes, or her dad yells, or things like that, you know. Nobody really used the terms like, I know a family that's experiencing domestic violence, but it was just kind of an undercurrent in the background of everybody's like perception. But because there's so much underreporting and so much, underreporting and so much non-disclosure, a lot of folks don't know that it's a thing in AAPI communities, at least in the way that, in the Western conception, domestic violence, sexual assault. And if you look at statistics, if you look at like the NISVIS study from the CDC or, you know, census data, things like that, a lot of times it's true that abuse in AAPI communities tends to appear pretty low, at least compared to abuse in other ethnicities. And so there's the sense that it doesn't really happen. And then there's the model minority myth of like, you know, AAPI, or at least Asians, are this model minority and no issues and everything is great and perfect, and, you know. So what that leads to a lot of the time is that, you know, if you don't think that there's other people like you who are experiencing it, that may stop you from saying, hey, I'm somebody who experienced it too. You may think that you're abnormal, it's just like a fluke or something like that. Beyond that, and we talked about this before, being the survivor of abuse is more shameful than being the perpetrator of it. And this is from kind of the community's perspective, right? So if you're a man who is abusing his partner or his wife, often that's just, well, you know, he's really stressed, he's trying to keep the family together, maybe she's not performing her duties or her role very well, you know, it just happens, right? That's just something that happens. But for whatever reason, if you're somebody who's experiencing abuse, that's considered shameful, you know. It's kind of goes into the people whispering about you around the corner. You have that kind of scarlet letter on you for just the duration of your participation in the communities. Everybody will know that you're a survivor of violence, that you're being abused by your partner. And there's shame in that, especially if you, like we said, if you reach out for help, if you leave your family, if you leave your partner. Part of that's because sex and relationships are private. You know, you talk about them with your partner, theoretically. You don't really talk about it with your parents, you don't talk about it with your children, you don't talk about it with, other community members. Sometimes in some groups there's like a faith leader that you can go to talk about it. Sometimes there's a community elder or like a clan elder you can talk about it with. But a lot of times these folks, they're not trained in DBSA, so they may say like, well, you should just try to work things out with the partner, or you should just try to be strong or try to endure it. Maybe you should pray more. So oftentimes folks don't have somebody that it's okay to share about with, that it's not taboo. Yeah.
Do other women say stuff like that, even though they're probably going through the same thing? They wouldn't be more acceptable to help
Yeah.
another.
You're talking about like if like two people are
Yeah.
both experiencing abuse and they,
And, you know, and, like say they were in church and
Yeah.
she goes and tells her friend, you know, and the friend kind of like doesn't want anything to do with her, but yet the friend is
Yeah.
going through
I think.
you would think that friend would wanna help more.
You would think. No, but I think it does happen where, you know, it's kind of, I don't know what the right term is, but it's kind of like a hypocrisy almost, like you judge the other person for basically experiencing the same thing that you are. And a lot of times, what happens is survivors may not be aware fully of what they're experiencing. They may not consider what they're experiencing abuse. A lot of times, like in AAPI languages, there's no terms for, you know, domestic violence, there's no terms for sexual assault or, you know, marital rape and things like that. So you're not even thinking of what's happening to you in those terms. You're just thinking, you know, you're uncomfortable or you're scared. So I think that's a big part of it too, is that if a friend then shares about their experience with you, you may lead to kind of like judging them, or, you know, even though you may be experiencing something similar.
Or probably the partner, the friend too, would
Yeah.
probably say, don't,
Yeah.
you know.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of, because the culture is so collective, there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of gossip. People like to gossip, people like to judge and talk about others, and I think sometimes it's easier to do that to others than to think about what you're experiencing in your own family.
Mechanism of self-preservation.
Yeah.
You don't want to lift up things for yourself. And I know we always say about like, oh my gosh, women need to do X, Y, and Z, but women are also a part of the patriarchal system, raised that way. So you would think you would want people to act in a different way, but that doesn't necessarily happen. I always give an example of hazing. If you've gone through the ritual of hazing, which is what it's called here, in India it's called ragging, you would think that you would be more merciful to the new class coming in, but turns out people who have been hazed tend to be worse with the folks that are coming in, and it's the I went through this, now you can go through it mentality.
And a lot of times it's, even though it's not talked about, it's normalized. So, you know, you think that what you're experiencing is normal and okay, and you think what your friend is experiencing is normal and okay. You know, I mean, I think we shared earlier about how a lot of times this pressure and this judgment comes from your own family, the female members of your own family, more than it comes from your husband's, your partner's family.
Yeah, because probably all the, you know, API victims that I've talked to or worked with, they've gone back because it was because of the family, their own family, their own mom and dad, and brothers and sisters.
Because it reflects, the family is thinking it's reflecting poorly on us too.
Right.
If our daughter is, you know, this is happening to her and she's doing this, then that's a reflection on us as a family. And that's not just the family here, but it could also be the family in the home country. Sometimes the extended family too. You know, it gets around, right? People talk to other people. Survivors who have intersecting identities. The reality is that a lot of AAPI communities, and it does vary a lot depending on the place and, you know, the particular community and the, you know, individuals, but a lot of them are, there's a lot of isms, right? There's a lot of classism, there's sexism, there's intolerance for LGBTQ identities, you know, children who are LGBTQ or children who are gender fluid or, you know, non-binary. A lot of times parents or families don't understand, or if maybe the parents understand, like we talked about acculturation earlier, like the families may understand, maybe the grandparents don't understand, maybe the uncles don't understand. There's ableism very present in many AAPI communities. There's that whole if we have a disabled child, if we have a mentally disabled or physically disabled child, a lot of folks will hide them away because that's considered shameful on the family to have a child. So I've known families who have had a disabled child and like nobody knows about it. It's just not talked about. And so when it comes out, it's like, I didn't even know you had that child. Well, it's because we never talk about them. We just keep them at home. So survivors who do have disabilities, may not find solace and comfort in their family. Same with survivors who experience mental illness. Mental illness is something that's stigmatized, I think, across the board, but especially in AAPI communities and families. It's a huge rising issue where a lot of children are committing suicide, and parents, don't understand, or parents are not supportive. It's not something that's understood as an issue. It's seen as like a weakness, just stay strong. Why are you so sad? Why are you so depressed? Like that sort of thing. It's not understood in a lot of AAPI cultures. And same with substance abuse. So, because survivors from these communities, they may not have a supportive family they can go back to. They may not have supportive community that they can go back to because their families are thinking, well, you're gay, so, that's what you get for being in that relationship in the first place, And a lot of times, obviously, the abuser will use that against them. If you try to break up with me, I'm going to tell your parents that you were dating me in this, gay relationship. I'm going to tell your family, I'm going to tell your community, things like that. So I think this quote about how in a lot of API cultures you don't talk about emotions, right? That's a big stereotype, but it comes from somewhere. A lot of stereotypes do come from somewhere. Is that you're not supposed to talk about emotions, you don't share love, you don't hug, you just move along, right? If you're feeling sad, well, just suck it up and just move along. You don't need to go to therapy. Therapy is like a Western thing.
I think that's changing though.
It's changing, yeah. Were you gonna say something?
I was just thinking, I just saw that and I'm wondering, I know we are saying AAPI survivor, but maybe we should be saying Filipina because I'm presuming that's who everyone here is meeting rather than AAPI, right? Because then we could narrow down a little bit more on that cultural nuance. So it was more that part that you got me mid open mouth.
Yeah. No, that's fair. Yeah. But I think, a lot of what we're trying to share applies across, generally and very broadly across a lot of communities and cultures, and not just AAPI. It seems like including Filipino communities. So I wanted to do a little bit of a reflection. Is if you're interacting with an AAPI survivor or somebody who you think might be a survivor of violence, and they seem hesitant or they seem afraid, maybe even standoffish or antagonistic towards you, how might you respond to that? What are some approaches or strategies that you use?
I think one approach would be just sharing our confidentiality, like what that means in our agency, and that they're safe to, express what's going on. We're not here to judge and stuff.
That's a big one, because a lot of people are afraid, well, who are you gonna tell or who's gonna find out about this?
I think for me would be also letting them know that just by making an appointment doesn't mean that they have to report it, right? They're here to get services, and that it's not just getting a restraining order that we help, and to share some of the resources and say, if you want to stay with the person, what can we do to make a safety plan and create that.
God, that is a huge one. I think whoever does the intake has to be on top of that in terms of like, we're just giving information, we're taking information, nothing will happen against your will. So just-
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of, probably not just the API survivors, because domestic violence and sexual assault as like a public health concern is something that they view as American, as Western, they don't understand what happens if I reach out for help. They may think like, well, if I talk to, one of you guys about what happened to me, well, the police is gonna get called, my husband's gonna get taken away, my children are gonna get sent to, foster, all these things, and, they may not know that.
All the threats that have been used against folks, that your children, one of the biggest threats in our immigrant power and control view is the fear of either deportation or the kids being taken away. I think those are two big ones.
Or even how we do intakes. I think for me, one of the things I see more is when we do an intake, we also get that information just for our database, so if their address or things like that, but then you get people coming in just for the first time and they're like, well, why are you asking me for my address? And I understand we need it for like our information, it might not necessarily like we explain to them, but even getting that information on the first time, it's also for them kind of like suspicious.
Yeah.
Even though you explain it, so just kind of like understanding that, like when is the right time to ask those questions, or is that something we could get on the second time we meet?
Or not even, we just ask for the zip code and not the physical address. So there's definitely that.
I think sometimes people too think we have an agenda, that we're like, okay, you called, we really want you to leave, we really want you to come into shelter, and really trying to, kind of just building on what kind of Elizabeth said, but like really letting them know, like, you are in control, like, we're here to help, but like, if, we're not gonna try to talk you into something that you don't wanna do, we're just gonna, provide the information and support your decision.
Provide options.
The complete flip side of it, which I don't know if you ever work with South Asians, Indians at all, is like, well, you're the expert, I'm here, you tell me what to do.
Right.
And then you tell them what to do and they don't want to do that, then it's like, no, tell me again, or I'll go to the third person or the fourth person, or you tell me what to do, I did it, and now I'm in a mess, and you told me what to do, right? So there's that as well, that is the reality.
That's what we.
Yeah, we try to be really careful because we do get people who ask us like, well, you tell me what I should do, and we always kind of like,
Here are your
we
options.
can tell you options, but that is gonna have to be your decision because you kind of are the expert on your situation. And,
It's
One of
building the trust and giving
Yeah.
Yeah.
space, for that trust to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a long time or a lot of courage for somebody to share, especially if a lot of survivors, it's not the first time they've experienced abuse. They may have talked to somebody about it in the past and didn't get the response that they needed. And so, like the courage it takes to reach out again, and the trust is so important in that situation. A lot of community organizations like shelters tell us that people don't come to them for services. That's not the first time they meet somebody. They meet them at their food pantry or like at their cultural, like Lunar New Year celebration or, support, like other things like that. And it's after repeated times meeting this person that the person will say, like, and not even say in those words, but it'll come out that person is experiencing abuse. So it's like after that trust is built with that shelter or with that agency who's also doing other work in the community.
And sometimes I think for us, some of the things, at least I see, is that sometimes they might just want that validation of someone believes me, right? Like, just I want to go to your agency and say my story and know that someone believes me, and then they decide whether that's something they want to report later on or not.
Yeah.
How do people come to your agency, or where do you meet people? Or do you meet people?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
sometimes it's like law enforcement referrals, sometimes it's just people that walk in based on like community outreach that we've done. They might have heard of our services elsewhere, but a lot of it we see through like law enforcement referrals.
I was gonna say, law enforcement sounds about right. I don't see people coming.
Or community
Yeah.
partners who refer.
Or
Okay.
Carla, she goes to the
Yeah.
schools and talks about this, and then the kids are like, you know, my parent, or like my mom or my dad is experiencing this, and then they kind of tell the person or their parent about it, and then they'll come.
Yeah.
Hey,
So Carla's a big person too.
so happy to hear that.
Another door.
Do you have a partnership or something with the medical center, like downstairs, if folks come in there?
We do have an understanding with them, so if they have a victim of DV or sexual assault, we kind of have an agreement with them. They'll call us and we can go downstairs and meet with them. If their abuser happens to still be with them and they're in the waiting room, for example, it all happens kind of discreetly.
That's really nice
yeah.
that you're like right here on,
Yeah, love that. So another fabulous flop, no, this one wasn't, was when I was pregnant, TMI, I went through a really crazy, serious, like, what do you call it? I'm saying serious, not serious. Special
Like
conditions, whatever, complicated pregnancy.
High-risk
right?
pregnancy.
High risk, thank you. I had to go to the doctor's office every week, and I was accompanied by my husband. It was just him and I. And we were sitting one day, and I was so proud of the fact we had our cards in many languages. And this is Stanford. And I was sitting there one day, I think I must have been feeling better. And I was like, wait a minute, why has no one asked me yet about whether I'm being abused or not? I mean, I'm pregnant, we know studies, it's high risk. Well, let's not also get into the fact that people of color are not asked about other situational issues the way, in that much. So I'm sitting there and my husband was like, okay, there she goes again. So I asked them, I was like, you know what, are you not doing this screening? And so they took me to a room and I was like, no, I would not say so. And Art was like, cringe, like, they're used to it now. My family's used to this. But I was just like, no, but I mean, are you asking? Like, why are you not asking? We have our brochures here and all of that. They're like, oh, you work, this was the reaction, oh, you work for them? Okay, all right. But I'm thinking, shouldn't you be asking right now, right? So I think it's that outreach as well that really truly matters. Or like, are you asking the right questions? And what if it was not my husband? Reality is that, or my partner, reality is that I might have a mother-in-law or a sister-in-law, and then they would go in with me and then would just ask me that question, what am I going to say, right? So culturally kind of keeping a little bit of that in mind also, that it may not be the actual person, the harm doer that is with them, but that also that there are multiple harm doers. It's not necessarily just your partner who you're most intimate with, and that's why we don't say IPV, because in our case, it could be multiple folks.
We have, I know, I used to do the domestic violence for the kids. Let me rephrase that. That did not sound right. In charge of the program for kids exposed to domestic violence, but we used to partner with Kaiser. And you would go, and they have our brochures, of course, and once in a while you get them to ask you, do you feel safe at home? But there were a lot of times that I went where I wasn't asking that. So when we had our meetings, I brought that up because they were like, are we asking this? And most of them said, yes. And I said, thank you. Like, I've gone asked a few times, but there's been many times where I haven't. And so they asked, what is the reason? And most of them said that it was fear of of not knowing what to do after that person disclosed.
Yeah.
And they knew they would call us if they needed to, but it was just like that's the reason that they were not asking, a fear of like, what do I say? What do I do after they disclose this? It was interesting that they had the brochure there, like you said, it was CC, but it was just that fear of what am I gonna do?
And it feels, I think for a lot of people, it feels like a door that once you open it, you can't close it again.
Yeah.
You're gonna be a victim for the rest of your life. That's just who you are. And
Or also they said that it was that when they did ask, some people would get upset, like, why are you asking me? Does it look like I'm a victim? And so it was also that fear.
yeah.
So can I ask, because we got that grant, where would be like a safe place in American Canyon to say, like, to set up camp? Or to be able to provide services? Like what?
That's a really good question, and I think
Because the American Canyon is a small community, you know, it's
so. I mean, you're gonna say something?
No, finish.
I
Yes,
think
of
that's a
course.
really good question. I think it's important to know, and we'll talk about this coming up very soon. But it's like, where did the Filipino community gather? You know, like where. If you think about your community, just like going out, you know, getting groceries, eating dinner, where are you seeing the Filipino folks? Are there like cultural centers that they're going to? Are there grocery stores? Are there like nail salons, maybe like hairstylists and things like that? We did hear from the Filipino leaders that Gina introduced us to that a lot of them are gathering in Vallejo. Because that's where their roots are. So when they want to, you know, be in culture and community with each other, they're going to Vallejo.
I was gonna piggyback off of that and add a stereotype, but not a stereotype. A lot of the people moving here are in the nursing facility, so obviously at the nursing facility, and then the other big one for me, which I'd say is for any immigrant community, is the faith. So it's the churches, and in that case, it's not outreach. Like, I wish I could say you go in there, set up camp, do have your brochures, and everyone's going to come to you. It needs to be literally a DV 101 for the pastor and the deacons and the whoever. And we've seen that really be successful in some of the Chinese and the Korean churches, where they actually do the 40-hour training for the pastors.
And it's like a really long process that they had to go
Yeah.
through to get there, to get those people to actually listen to them, because some of them can be really resistant. A lot of, or at least in those communities, they're very traditional and conservative, and they kind of look at the DV movement as being a challenge to the traditional like religious values. And so I think it can be a really long process of, building up and saying, like, we're not here to take
Break
away
your
your
home.
community. Yeah.
Or to break your home. We're not home break. I think that is like one of the first things
Yeah.
to talk about. Like, our goal is to make sure that everyone is safe. I think it's also what is News's lens. Is it like we will refer you to law enforcement versus we will also be working with a person that does harm or have resources for that? You said you get a lot of referrals from law enforcement. What does that mean? I remember when we got referrals from law enforcement, they were like, oh, this person's not pushing. Or the client was like, I don't want to press any charges, and I'm like, sorry, it's out of our hands, it's gone to the DA. So again, you're not in control, and that's not what you want. And traditionally, or mostly, anecdotally, I don't have the data for this, but anecdotally, about 90% of the clients did not want a restraining order. Actually, they were the ones who were abandoned or dropped or dumped. A restraining order was very important for those that faced high lethality, but the reality is like you just dumped and not taken care of and not paid child support. So you kind of have to see what is happening in the culture, right? Because abandonment and being left to fend for yourself and not have your immigration done is like an even higher, not to like pay the oppression Olympics with any sort of abuse, but it's like higher. Like, what do you do with it? You can't go to a shelter stay because you're not abused, but you are abused. You're just not physically abused, right? So things like that. Keeping those in mind.